So you want to make a multiplayer game in Unreal Engine? Well, here's the crash course. There are a few things you need to know before we can begin. There's this thing called the client and there's this thing called the server. The client is the person who connects to the server, presumably to play the game. The server is the machine in some random location elsewhere in the world, hopefully not too far away, that makes all the decisions in the game. There are two types of servers, the dedicated server and the listen server. A listen server is where the server is also playing the game with the clients. If you've ever joined your friend's Valheim game through Steam, for example, then you were joining a listen server. Your friend's PC is the listen server and you are the client. There's also a dedicated server. A dedicated server is using what's called a headless version of your game. Basically, it's not doing any crazy rendering, it's not playing the game, it's just using a portion of its power to run the game. If you've ever played a competitive FPS or a persistent open world MMO, this is the type of server you're usually connected to. Now let's talk about the server-authoritative model and the concept of latency. The server-authoritative model means that anytime the client wants to do something, it has to ask the server if it can do that thing. The server then has to make sure that the client can do that thing, and then the server tells the client that it can do that thing. This is great, because it means that the client can't cheat. If the client uses a cheat program to try to fly to the other side of the world, the server just goes like, no, you can't do that. There is a problem with this though, and it's called latency, or lag. In games, we usually worry about round-trip latency, basically how long it takes for data to pass from the client to the server and back to the client. Let's say the client wants to do an attack, and there are 150 milliseconds of round-trip latency. That means it's going to take 150 milliseconds, or 0.15 seconds, between the player hitting their attack button and them actually seeing their character start the attack. And realistically, it would be more because the local system might have its own input latency depending on the quality of the hardware and your code. Now you might say, hey, that's less than a second, that sounds pretty good, and I'd say no! Try hooking up a 0.15 second delay to literally anything in your game, it will be awful. So how do we fix this? Well, it's called client prediction. Basically, we know we can do the attack animation. We can locally check if we have enough stamina and stuff, and then do the attack animation on the client without even waiting for the server to tell us that we can. The server then does its thing and tells everyone else who might be connected that the attack is happening. Now, we can't locally predict everything. The server still needs to decide if the damage actually happened, etc. But when it comes to the client's character, we basically want everything that we can to be predicted. And that's pretty much the high concept of networking in Unreal. Now, we have some good news, and it's that Unreal's character movement component is already locally predicted, so great, we don't need to worry about input latency on movement, thank goodness. Everything else though, well, you need to locally predict yourself. Now we need to talk about network emulation a little bit. Basically, Unreal can simulate lag for you, and it is really important when you're making a multiplayer game that you test with this, because some stuff just does not work if there's too much of a delay. In the emulation profile, I like to use average for general testing and bad for stress testing. So I'm going to walk you through how to make a locally predicted attack animation in Unreal. This will work for pretty much any engine version that has RPCs and anim montages. I'm working with a third-person template so we can actually see the animation on our character and stuff. Find an animation you want to play. This is not an animation tutorial. I will use this masterpiece that I created. Make sure it is an anim montage. You'll know it because it will say anim montage when you hover over it, and it will be colored blue. If you don't have an anim montage, right-click on the animation you want to use and choose Make Anim Montage. It is that easy. In your character's animation blueprint, go all the way to the anim graph and right-click, type default slot. Basically, anim montages have slots that they can play in. By default, they use the default slot unless you change it. Hook it up and we're all good. Animation part done. In your character's blueprint, right-click and get the left mouse button input. Drag off of that and type Play Anim Montage. This is the locally predicted anim montage that we talked about. Drag off of that and type Switch Has Authority. If this node returns authority, we are the server, and if it returns remote, we are the client. Now below all that, make two custom events named Multi-Anim and Server-Anim. Do this by right-clicking and typing Custom Event. When you select one, you will see some options in the Details panel to your right. Replicates here determines how the event will work over the network. Multicast events can only be called on the server, and they go out to everybody else. Run on server events only run on the server. This is nice though because the clients can call run on server events, which can in turn call multicast events. You might see where this is going. Run on client is not needed for this tutorial, but it basically just runs the event on the owning client, and it is called from the server. Make server-anim run on server, and make multi-anim multicast. Down below is the reliable checkbox. Basically, sometimes Unreal will skip firing networked events to save on bandwidth. Making these reliable ensures that they will always fire. You would want to leave this off if, for example, you were using this to simply fire some particle effects. But in our case, it's pretty important that everybody, sees the attack animation, so we turn it on. Now back above, we will call multi-anim off of the authority output, because the server can just, do that. Off of remote, we will call server-anim. Down below, off of the multi-anim event, add a branch node and plugin is locally controlled. This node tells us if the pawn in question is our local player or somebody else's player character. We do this because the multicast event will fire for the person who called it in the first place, so if we don't do this, the animation will play twice for them. After that, put a copy of your play anim montage plugged into the false output. Basically, if this character is controlled by the person sitting at the computer, then they already played it up above. Next, off of server-anim, we literally just call multi-anim because the server-anim event makes it so that we're running off of the server. Now finally, plug the animation input of the play anim montage nodes into their corresponding events. Then up above, select all of this, right-click on one of the nodes, and hit collapse to function. This makes a new function with the nodes we selected inside of it. Now plug the animation inputs for these nodes in here into the function input. When you go back to your left mouse button input, it will look all nice and neat. Just don't forget to select your animation. And boom, there you go. Even though you're simulating lag with the network emulation, everything happens instantly on the client. Just, make sure you're playing on a client to test properly. By the way, we hit 1,000 subs. Thank you, I really appreciate it, and I hope you found this video helpful. I also want to let you know that I've started a Discord server, which should be up and running when this video goes live. If you have any questions or need help or want to show off your work or just hang out, that is the place to go.